Hello and welcome. I'm Arvid from London, and I'm joined here today by Jonathan Buckner and Carl Banks. Jonathan from Unison and UCU, and Carl from Unite. I'm going to give it over straight away to them to introduce themselves. So, Jonathan, why don't you start?
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Arvid, for that. As Arvid said, I'm a member of Unison and UCU trade unions. I should emphasize that I suspect, like Carl, I'm talking in a personal capacity here today. And until recently, I worked in a university library, first as a shelver, and then as part of the user services team supporting students there. In terms of the union, I was for about 10 years or so a workplace representative supporting members individually and collectively. And for the last 5 years, I was a branch secretary as well. So when I was thinking a little about what to say today, just to kind of set the scene, it made me think about when I started at LSBU, at the university that I worked at. And when I look back, I remembered that the first thing that I wanted to know was where I could pick up a membership form for the union. And so to me, that raised a few questions. What is it that made joining a union so important? Why was it not solely a rational, but I think also an emotional decision as well to want to join? What is the effective dimension of trade unionism? And more broadly, why do trade unions matter? So, the first thing I think is, what is a trade union? And I think some people see trade unions as a form of workplace insurance, which is to be called upon if needed. It's an investment which is akin to your car insurance, or your contents insurance, or anything like that. Union membership in that sort of model is a commodity to be purchased on the market and assessed according to market principles. And I think this entails a very passive concept of membership. It's responsive rather than proactive, and you activate your union membership once something has happened, after the fact. And it's a relationship where unions and union members stand in a customer-based transactional relationship to one another. And I think where unions and union members exist as separate poles rather than being intrinsically related. Now, supporting members when they have problems and showing there are benefits to union membership is important. But for me, a union is not just an economic calculation. And I think models based on unions delivering for a passive membership of what are in effect customers or clients is both problematic and self-defeating. By contrast, I see the idea and practices of trade unionism as having something utopian about them. I think they provide a potential way of looking at and rethinking our fundamental present social relationships. And to me, this sort of utopianism is something that's quite essential. It's a way of seeing that there are always multiple possibilities in the present, and that what is not what has to be. For a lot of people I speak to in higher education, which is my background, their workplaces are characterized by mentalities and practices of command and control from senior management, by distinctions between those who think and command and those who are expected to do and obey. And if you're on a lower grade, so in other words, if you earn less money, and this usually means that you're more likely to be a Black, a woman, or a migrant worker, you're just there to do as you're told. You are, I think, in the dominant corporate speak in this model, just a human resource. Someone or something's been moved around, maneuvered and manipulated, by smaller groups with higher status than you. And in this conception, we're reduced to nothing but economic units from which ever more physical labor and mental exertion is demanded. And this is tyrannical. Trade unions matter because they have the potential to be, and sometimes are, something very different. To me, trade unionism is about creating horizontal relationships of care, compassion, and solidarity, where members look out for one another, where we don't draw a distinction between a union on the one hand as a fixed, unchanging institution and members as transitory, temporary clients, but recognize that members are the union. Members shape unions, they decide what unions do, they change unions into what they want them to be. So trade unionism is about creating alternative forms of community, alternative cultures, premised on democracy and direct control over the conditions of your life, where your voice matters. Rather than being solely responsive and individually oriented, I think this provides the possibility of large numbers of people acting together in common interest, having each other's backs, and demanding changes that stop injustices from happening in the first place. And perhaps that's why being in a union is emotional and affective as well as rational, why it can't be reduced to just a form of insurance. Because I think unequal, oppressive social relationships are felt. I think it hurts to be stressed or anxious about your job or when work colonizes your very thoughts. When Black, women, disabled, LGBT plus, and migrant workers are more likely to be in the lowest paid jobs or experience disproportionate levels of bullying and harassment, that isn't something abstract. That's something visceral and personal. And in our society, the disconnect and I think the tension between the simultaneity of democracy, or at least the demand for democracy in the political sphere, and its absence in the economic, is not just a matter, I think, that's intellectually apprehended, but something that can be quite wrenching. So, to sum up, I see unions as a possibility. They're a possibility of rejecting that inequality and injustice are just individual burdens to bear, and burdens that we have to carry in isolation from one another. Rather, I think trade unionism is about demanding that things be different and then practicing that difference. It's about standing up for ourselves, but never standing up by ourselves. So I'm looking forward to hearing really a lot more from everyone else in this evening and from Carl as well. So thank you for that. That's that's the introduction.
Amazing. Thanks, Jonathan. That was a really beautiful way to get us started, to be honest. I think it's really put us in a really good mood. And I think that's kind of I've picked out two themes already, which I'd like to come back to afterwards for a little Q&A session. So I'm picked up possibility, I've picked up insurance, and I think they're really powerful. But before we get too much into the weeds, I want to give Carl a chance to speak as well. And then we'll do the rest of it as well.
Yeah, whatever he said, I totally agree. Thank you. And so that was amazing, Jonathan. Seriously,
That was really
that
beautiful.
was
Yeah.
just really succinct and eloquently put in a way which you don't always get to hear. Yeah, so I'm Carl Banks. I am a member and equality chair for Unite the Union. I use pronouns he, him, his. I'm also a library administrator focusing on e-resources in the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecology, gynecologists, which is a relatively new job, but I do have quite a lot of experience working in specialist health libraries in London area particularly. And I'm been involved in libraries for about the last 8 years. Um, Prior to that, I was actually a trade union official, paid member of staff at the PCS, the Public and Commercial Services Union, which is a union for civil service members. So working in the public sector and those who have been 2P'd over to the private sector as well. And yeah, and I've also, when I was there as a member of staff, staff had its own union, which was GMB Union, which is one of the larger ones, representing staff there. And so when I left PCS and later I left GMB and then I joined Unite. So I guess there's kind of a flexibility there. And to be fair, when I was not a member of a trade union, I felt incredibly lost. I've been a trade union member since 2004, and that was 2003, sorry, which is when I was working in the civil service. And I think, Jonathan, you explained it very eloquently about, the hierarchical structures, the very much you do and don't say. You just kind of follow my lead and just shut up and get on with it. And obviously, going in at a kind of a lower kind of administrative grade, it is incredibly hard to get your voice heard. But encountering a couple of trade union reps at the time, I got involved through equalities. Essentially, equalities was definitely my thing. I've been equalities activist for many years before. I'd started my work in life, and it was refreshing to be able to meet people who you could have a water cooler moment and just go, I'm thinking about this, or this has kind of happened. What do you think? And then just kind of having my eyes made wide open about um, some kind of alternative reality. I think you kind of nailed it, Jonathan. Trade unions provide an alternative in lots of ways, an alternative narrative, an alternative way of looking at things, perspective, an alternative route to kind of getting out of either a sticky mess, if that's what you're in or kind of out of issues that you just do not feel comfortable with. And it's great to kind of have that kind of solidarity and unity with fellow members, and not just unions within your own union, but hopefully across the trade union movement as well. Although there is kind of some friendly and perhaps a little less friendly competition sometimes as well. I forgot to add, I am speaking totally in a personal capacity here as well. Yeah, so I guess I kind of got involved in equalities. I joined PCS Union as a member, and then later I got involved in the local branch, which is kind of the workplace level of organisation for trade unions, for those who are not sure. And then an ideal job came up at PCS, and I went for it and I got it, and I ended up becoming a member of staff and then a member of a new union, GMB. And then from there on, it's a long story. I won't go into all the gory details, but it's quite interesting. I have the experience of working both for a trade union and as a very active member who ended up getting elected up onto the national executive, so the highest kind of level of the union, for by following kind of the equality strand and specifically LGBT plus equality. But at the moment, yeah, I'm working, as I said, in RCOG, which is not a unionised workplace. It doesn't have any union representation whatsoever, and it's quite an eye-opening experience when you're used to working in unionised places. And perhaps we might explore some of that, maybe some experiences you've got yourselves. We can share that. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Amazing, Carl. Thank you very much. Thanks both to you for those opening statements. I think that set us up very, very well. So from Jonathan, we got that like big picture view, and then from Carl, we got a very personal way into the union. So you can like kind of imagine a little person on that picture. Like, what does it mean to be inside of it all? I've prepared a series of questions here, but please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand to ask your own questions as well. I've let myself be inspired a bit by Nick Robinson, from BBC Radio 4, does that political thinking show. And his whole deal, he always opens it with like, rather than this being a news interrogation off, it's a conversation with people. So that's the kind of spirit I'd like to keep this in throughout. So, and then maybe Carl, because you've just spoken, we stick with you, and because obviously I gave Jonathan the word first. And I want to kind of ask you and maybe take you back to your roots, like not just your workplace roots, but your roots back home in your childhood home maybe. And I was going to ask you whether politics, and especially union politics, was ever a topic at your kitchen table growing up. Was that something that your people discussed, or was it really that you come to your first workplace and suddenly there was this whole new world, because as you said?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a kind of very rural, kind of small market town in West England on the border of Wales. And I think that's kind of quite important to set context, because I think there are kind of pockets of union kind of activity where I think, around the UK where there are hotspots where it's definitely kind of more well known. But definitely in my neck of the woods, we didn't speak politics, we didn't talk religion, it was kind of very much let's not get involved in those discussions, because we'll only end up all falling out with one another. And there would be very kind of casual conversations about the news. I know as a child I was quite turned off by the news. I find it quite exceedingly dry. I found it was just a lot of people moaning and complaining all the time. So hey, nothing new. But it never really felt like solution based. And I think that kind of always puzzled me. It's like, well, why won't they sort this out? And why are they kind of always arguing this, that, and the other? But yet, ironically, everybody around me, so as a child and then all the adults around me, would talk non-stop about work. They talk about their day experience, they talk about what happened, who said what to who, how they felt about that, how they felt excluded, how they felt mystified that somebody got promoted and they didn't. And so all these kind of conversations are happening, around the dinner table anyway. And when the kind of all the family kind of got together, they're always talking about work in one way. And yet nobody was a union member. Nobody talked about trade unions. And my very early memories really of that is, which I think we'll come to a bit later, but are a bit fuzzy. So I think, yeah, it wasn't, politics weren't really talked about,
Really,
and
that's really
trade
interesting
unions
because
never really came up. And
yeah,
yet, I think deep down, I had a very strong sense of what was fair. And I do remember having quite a few heated debates, discussions with both my parents and
amazing. Yeah.
one of my grandparents about um, various issues, all sorts of issues, and then getting told, you're a bit gobby, calm down, be quiet.
That's really interesting,
uh,
yeah, because obviously
which
that
yeah.
grandparent generation can obviously have like very much different experiences because obviously they've had very much different fights than you as a child would have had, or your
Sure.
parents would have
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because
Sure.
I grew up in big cities, and for us it was a constant topic. And maybe I've got that outside of perspective because should really I'm from Austria. I'm not originally from the UK, but I went to uni in Durham, and that what you said about some areas of the country having that spirit and that history a lot more. Obviously, they do the miners' gala every year, so that was like at uni was a constant topic. But also back home in Austria, my mum used to her first lawyer job was for something called the Arbeiterkammer, which is a state mandated union everyone in Austria is part of. So as soon as you become an employee, part of your like sort of national insurance and stuff goes towards paying your membership dues in that, and they sort of negotiate on behalf of everyone. And there's an equivalent group called the Wirtschaftskammer, which every employer is part of as well as soon as they open a business, and part of their taxes go towards it.
Mm.
So that's really interesting. But
Yeah.
before we get too much into Carl's story, I want to also give
Yeah.
Jonathan a chance to talk about it and like talk about that a little bit as well. You know, what was it like growing up with you? Was unions a big topic at the dinner table, or was it
Mm.
something you came to later, like Carl was?
Yeah, this is going to be quite boring for everyone because it's quite similar to Carl. Um, not growing up in a small town, but yeah, politics wasn't a particularly big issue. I think I remember when New Labour won in 1997. That's about the first political thing that I remember because it was all over the news, and certain teachers at school, mostly were happy, but I think the head teacher seemed a bit crestfallen. So I do remember that. Um, but no, I mean, in terms of discussions at home, there's a lot of family history in terms of trade unions, but it wasn't a big thing that we would talk about. But I think what Carl was talking about in terms of everyday life and politics is a really interesting matter because that's whether it's at home or not, everyday life is fundamentally saturated with politics. Whether it's the home is interpenetrated by work, by school, by faith organizations, by what you hear and what you see, by things at a national regional level, news and things like that. And ideologies circulate at everyday levels as well. Ideas do too. So the everyday level is fundamentally political. If you're going out and about and you go into central London and you're seeing homelessness in terms of homeless people on the street, seeing that and asking why is that, that's political because it's about choices, it's about power, it's about why these things are happening and why alternatives are not happening, because these things shouldn't be. And so for me it was more talking to people at school, it was more hearing and seeing things like that rather than explicit discussion. I think that can form certain senses of what you think are right and wrong, and maybe initially you might see them as more moral or ethical positions, but then you realize actually they're fundamentally political. So yeah, I don't want to be too boring, but I think quite similar to
No,
Carl.
that's really good, and I think that's a good space to keep in as well for now because I think we're still in a bit of that table setting phase, and I think one aspect we haven't touched on yet today is obviously this is a celeb event, this is a library event, and trade unions, and I want to be a bit provocative here. Isn't that just something for factories where you're on the floor and it's like hard, backbreaking work, and you have to really look after your own health when you're working, but also you have to provide for your families. You have to kind of find a way to get along with your employer. Like what role do unions play in libraries? Because it's it's a lot of mental work, it's a lot of computer work. Like, why? Answers on a postcard. Yeah, maybe Carl, you go
I
first
just
because
went
I think
jumping in.
you raised your voice in there.
Yeah, I think the nature of work has changed when trade unions were kind of originally created in and there's a long, long history about this, but roughly, the 1840s when they start organizing in workplace, I believe. It's particularly looking at kind of the industrial sectors, manufacturing sectors, and kind of those and things. And obviously, the nature of work was so much different as it is today. And I think that's kind of quite important to remember because quite often we are told time and time again it's like trade unions are those who are like the working class, it's those kind of industries and the manufacturers and those who are kind of on lower pay rather than the managers and the senior managers and those who work in offices and that. And I think there's a big thing to be done here about demythologizing some of this and demystifying that actually you're a worker full stop, you are still vulnerable to the same whims of power holding that the power holders have, and they're usually senior management and government and others directing policy, telling us how to be, basically. And I think it's, for example, I think I can give an example when I was
Yeah, but please. As soon as you think of an
officer
example, please go with it. I think that would
as
be really
a
helpful for
a
people.
health and safety officer in PCS. I find it quite interesting talking to my health and safety reps because there was this. I would like to call them my clipboard brigade, where it's very kind of traditional, fundamental, like it's all about the slips and trips and the physical environment. Absolutely perfect, absolutely necessary, really, really, really essential day to day, looking after everybody's health, safety, and welfare. Absolutely critical role to do. But there were also those health and safety reps who also understood that bullying and stress and kind of low pay and not having the right to work flexibly and these sorts of things also affect health and well-being, and potentially safety as well, and so would get involved in a much kind of broader sense of what health is and what safety is and what well-being is. And I think that's really, really important because that kind of describes to us a much more kind of office-based kind of working practices, also perhaps remote working as well. And I think, how work has changed, the nature of work has changed, and how our definitions of health and well-being have kind of changed with that as the nature of work itself has changed, kind of quite important because that's
Yeah,
also meant that the reps themselves, how we look at things has changed and is constantly evolving too.
perfect. Let me pin you right there, Jonathan. You want to jump in on this, like the nature of the rep inside the library, and like being like,
Mm.
do you have to define yourself? That you even have to your own members demystify of like, well, there's a reason the union exists inside a library space. Or is it very
Mm.
obvious when you come to people and like you should be in the union? Everyone's like, oh yeah, I remember my dad's been in a union. That's something you do. But you have to really explain to people like what is the connection to libraries here?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I would say I think libraries, my experience, they tend to be more unionized than other places. Um,
That's
I think
surprising.
libraries are very often heavily unionized, and there is a culture within libraries. So even if it's not something that you've had growing up, within libraries, there is a strong culture of union membership. And when people are in a library, my experience again is it's very normal for there to be conversation about the union, for there to be union posters, union leaflets, for
Do you
people
think
to go
that's
to their
because
union
libraries are set
meetings.
up to be sort of empowering institutions from the get-go, or is it just the people who work in them?
I think it's probably, again, it could well be both. I think it may be people who are drawn to libraries. Most people that I've met in libraries often come from humanities, social science backgrounds if they've gone to university. And I think that definitely gives a certain perspective. Um, but I think it's also being, feeling comfortable to talk about it. One of the big things that I think um, inhibits union membership is where either either there aren't other members in the area that you work, or people don't talk about the union where you work, because then it gets seen as something which is almost risky or subversive to be a union member, and you feel like maybe you're sticking your neck up, you're going to get in trouble. Likelihood is you're not, and you're probably actually more protected by being in a union than if you're not, because an organization doesn't go, well, this person's not in a union, let's keep them on or something. They'll be like, okay, well, we don't care. They're going to go after you as much as anybody else. But having a culture that's very, very vocal about unions, I think encourages people to join. And if people don't join straight away, that's fine because people can make a decision. But being able to just talk to people on a regular rotating basis, so that when things change in their lives or when things change at work, they're able to say, okay, there's a problem here. Maybe the union is the solution, and actually this is a good time for us to get involved. Whereas if you don't have that visibility, there may well be problem, but no clear sense of where does the solution come in. And so, yeah, I definitely, I think libraries are a good place for unions. And just very briefly, I would say that given that in the public libraries have been horribly cut over the last 14 years,
Yeah.
we honestly, I think we can expect very little from the Labour Party when they win the next election. They've not exactly been forthcoming about spending more in terms of local councils. So ultimately, it is going to be unions that are going to have to stand up for public services and for people's jobs and for workers to have a say in how work changes. And if you're in it, you get that say. If you're not, the question is, well, what can we do? What are the alternative avenues to actually defending investment and spending and so on? I think the union is probably one of the big answers.
The two of you are making this really easy for me because I've shared with you some of the questions before, and I think that leads us very neatly onto like now that we're in the zone of discussing issues and so on. If you want to maybe share with us like a war story or two you've had, like so if once you were a union rep, you were representing someone, you had to maybe support a disciplinary case or something. Can you tell us about what that was like? Can you maybe demystify the process? But obviously, be careful to not share personal details. And we discussed this before, and obviously, we don't want to. And if it's something active, like don't get involved. But like, can you give us a good shape of the idea of what that was like, and like what kind of cases the union would get involved in?
Who do you want to go first, David?
Difficult, I guess. Well, maybe let's stick with you, Jonathan, because you brought the topic up. And you were
Okay.
like, okay, so obviously there's been stuff in the past that has happened in the UK, and there's stuff that has resonances to now. So maybe let's stick with that, and maybe if you were involved in discussions at the time about like a budget was cut or something disciplinary happened.
I mean, yeah. So if we're talking about disciplinary, so obviously, because I think they're different kinds of issues, you'd approach them differently. I think fundamentally, I think most people know what disciplinary is, which is you're alleged to have committed some act of misconduct. And that's generally considered something where you have willfully done something that the institution considers to be wrong. If you've done something they consider to be wrong, but it's considered to be maybe unintentional because you're not up to scratch with your skills, they would generally go down what they call a capability policy route. So disciplinaries deal with, we allege as an organization you have willfully done something that is bad or is wrong. And that can be very stressful for members. I think it's uniformly stressful for people to get this.
Yeah,
and very
because
often
the way you're saying it now, it sounds like already like an escalation. It's not like, oh, you didn't. It wasn't a skill issue as someone young like me would say, but like we think it was a skill issue, and then you deliberately still did something more wrong on top of that. So it's actually already like you're quite more serious if it's disciplinary.
And it can be. I think a lot of things can be dealt with more informally than sometimes they are at institutions.
Recruitment and retention of members, but quite often things aren't as clear cut as you're going to win or you're going to lose. Quite often there are winners and losers on both sides to some degree, and I think that's always been it. Not quite, not at the top of my head, but I'll come to one if I do.
Yeah, I know we'll come up to that now, I'm sure.
But I think with that, I think what's kind of quite important is that if you don't win kind of outright, what does that mean to the member, and how are they then communicating it to the rest of their colleagues, whether they're members or not? And then you've got the reps who are trying to recruit, and non-members are like going, well, you didn't actually win the case for so and so and so and so, when it was quite a straightforward, they see it in very kind of black and white terms perhaps.
Oh, interesting.
And
So is
so
that something you
I
try and
think
keep in mind when you're involved in a case? So you're like, how could this look in the future?
It is. I mean, kind of on a wider kind of level, when the branch is kind of perhaps evaluating what kind of cases it is taking on board and kind of the levels of success, you can, in my experience, we have kind of communicated with, anonymizing all details and things, saying, we've won this great case, and actually what we've got from that is we've gone back to the negotiating table and we've been able to change some of the policies or practices. We've got some new training that's going to be rolled out, because clearly there's a need, particularly for managerial level training, but also for kind of all staff as well. So it's sometimes it's not just that that's the end of the story. There's communication, there's the recruitment, there's the training, there's the learning, I think, always from reps and also from members. And I think that's a really big thing. My own, the example that I'm going to cite is going to be basically my own, when I myself took a grievance out against a couple of senior managers, because quite
That's very brave.
often
Thank you.
it was exceptionally brave and terrifying, and I did it collectively with
Yeah, but also
another
you
team.
feel welcome to share this in a public setting. I just want
Oh,
to
thank
acknowledge
you.
that.
Yeah, obviously I won't name names and things like that, but the point was that my point here is that it's not a one-way street. And because it's quite often, it'll be the manager who's found problems with the person they're line managing, or the union member in this case. But also, if we have an issue with management and they haven't followed procedure and they haven't followed policy and they haven't, and in my case, it was I didn't. My colleagues and I challenged the managerial decision, which wasn't evidence based, on a very dramatic change to our service and our collection. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. I mean, the long and the short of it was
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to press you for a little, but did they like try and get rid of the physical collection, or did they try and cut out a certain part of it, or was it like a more sort of an
basically
EDI
without.
folks who are like, I don't want to,
Yeah,
I don't
okay.
really care about
No, no.
equality's work. I just want to buy books on bones or whatever.
It was working for. I mean, one of the basis of our arguments was that we work in a membership led organization, a membership funded organization, and there was zero consultation with members. And this is a really big thing, right, in
I
unions. Like
think
if you
people who
don't
work in
consult your
libraries
members.
I think
Yeah.
everybody's had an acquisitions boss like that who's like, no, I am the library.
Yeah. Yeah, and also somebody,
Thank you.
clearly who doesn't work in libraries and making decisions without any evidence. And from a trade union perspective, for me, it's like, well, that's fundamental. I'm not just going to go in, wave a paper, start shouting at a manager and say, you've done this and you've done this, and without any facts backing up, because that's just going to fracture any goodwill or any kind of positive relationship or any relationship whatsoever. I don't believe in table thumping for the sake of it. I don't believe in kind of creating that. It's about long-term sustainable relationships within workplaces. And Jonathan's absolutely right. Most of the cases and I was involved in could have been dealt with a lot quicker, a lot informally at that informal level. We used to have in this country dispute regulations. So before you even escalated it up to employment tribunals, where I used to work many years ago, um, you would have to go through this process first to prove that you've tried to resolve this, in the workplace as best as you can. Of course, Tories came in, scrapped that. They scrapped lots of things which were our protections. So I guess what I'm saying is cases can be as small or as big as you like. They can be in any direction you like. They are never taken easily. They are always phenomenally stressful for all parties involved. And to go back to Jonathan's, really one of your earliest points, Jonathan, about this insurance policy, I think some of the hardest conversations I have is not necessarily talking to management and helping to represent my member of staff, but also ensuring that they are taking the lead and I am there just to kind of support them, is is to I'm not there to talk for them. At the end of the day, it's the individual who's there. Of course, you would have your pre-meeting conversations with them. How are we going to handle this? Do you feel confident to do this? Here's some more, we can stop the meeting at any time. We learn all these things. We go through quite a lot of training as union reps to be able to do that. But I think fundamentally it's down to experience and just listening to people and trying our best, and we don't always succeed. And I'm sure we could all cite terrible examples of terrible reps and terrible things they did behind our backs, or
Yeah,
they
wow.
didn't succeed. And I think we forget about the sheer number of successes that happen quietly behind the scenes and probably aren't shouted about because we're too busy getting on supporting our members
Well,
members on a day-to-day
yeah, so I mean, the
basis.
event is
Yeah.
called, being a library
Yeah.
union rep, and maybe Jonathan, you can jump in on this, but do you find it hard sometimes to manage your own well-being when you're part of a process, or do you find that there's a lot of solidarity between the union reps? Because I only really want to focus on that human element now, Carl. You've teed it up really well for me.
I,
And
I
thank you
think,
again for sharing.
yeah, I think in terms of well-being, I think that's an important one. I think
Yeah, like so
union
not
reps
so
are,
much focusing on your members, but maybe focus on
yeah.
yourself as well. But maybe like the focus on the member helps you yourself,
Mm.
compartmentalize a little bit.
I think the thing that always needs to be remembered is union reps are volunteers. Um, there will be, they might get a certain amount of facility time. And facility time means that you get paid release from your job to do union activities and union duties. And the amount of facility time that you get will tend to vary. So it might be a little, it might be a lot, depending on where you work and the agreement you have. But ultimately, everyone there has been elected and they're a volunteer. So I think it's always important to remember that there isn't, certainly in my view, one thing we need to remember isn't a hierarchy between reps and officers and members. It's reps and officers who've been elected and other members on a horizontal equal setting. Um, so I think that obviously needs to be remembered that reps sometimes are taking a lot on. And it's important then that there is that support from other people in the branch, whether they're reps or not, to actually just make sure people are okay.
Thank
Um,
you.
I think I've been quite fortunate. I've had very good people that I've worked with, so there's always been that support. And a rep doesn't have to know everything. I think that's the important thing. You have other people who've gone other training and can give you ideas and input. And often you will be able to work as a team rather than just individually. So again, that's a better way of working than kind of being in a silo. I think both
Yeah,
for
Carl,
outcomes
I
as
see
well
you
as for
furiously
whole.
nodding. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think what's always interesting, and I found particularly interesting when I first joined as a union member was and found out about kind of all the different branch roles, is that you've got your chair and your secretary and your vice chair. You probably have a treasurer. You've got your learning rep, your equality rep, your health and safety rep. You've got your general kind of committee members, and a whole raft of them. And particularly health and safety, and at the time union learning reps, they were given particular, they, in law, kind of an element of facility time. I might be wrong about union learning. I think that's changed now, but everything else is kind of down to the agreement, which has to be agreed with the employer. And they could play tough ball and say, well, actually, you're only all going to get 2 hours a week to do your union stuff, so tough. And what that means is, obviously that's a negotiation we would try to make improvements on in favor of the union, but or the union members. And then, but that means, when would I be doing that as a rep? I'd be doing it in my own personal time, probably doing it at weekends, doing it in the
Yeah,
evenings.
yeah.
And I think it's very quickly you get into this kind of snowball effect of kind of doing longer hours, doing quite head scratching kind of work, very sensitive work, very confidential work. There's a lot of I think a lot of emotional intelligence, I think,
Mm.
really needs to go into the role. A lot of empathy and compassion. I think if you don't have that, then why are
Yeah,
you a rep in the
that's a
first
skill
place,
you
really?
gotta that's effort.
But the people are doing this because they believe it, and they have a real heart and soul for this. And I think that's not something to be sniffed at. And I think it's something trade unions are very good at tapping into and making use of, maybe exploiting to some degree. But people are doing this out of the goodwill, but they also do it because they know this works. This is an alternative that does work. It does produce success. It does produce results. Trade unions have campaigned for well over 170 plus years, and the things that we've got because of trade unions, we've got the 2-day weekend. That's because of trade unions. We've got extra annual leave. that's because of trade unions. We've got the national minimum wage. We've got equal pay. We've got a whole raft of legislative things. This is just in the UK, mind
Yeah,
you.
that's
It's
some strong
obviously
achievements.
different
Yeah,
elsewhere.
and I mean, personally, I'm very much
These
looking
kind of
forward to
things.
my 2-day weekend, I have to say, because I've been quite
Well,
ill.
you know,
Sorry for like
currently
jumping
we're
in. I
looking at
just
kind of
wanted to say that we've just reached about halfway in our time.
Oh,
So
crikey. Okay.
now that if the audience have heard some stuff and we had some quite serious engagement, I've seen your thumbs up there, Toby. So if you this is the time you can start thinking about maybe putting your own questions in. I've got a couple more questions left for Jonathan and Carl, but in about 10, 15 minutes or so, I'd really love to hear from the audience and see what you've made of the discussion so far, and maybe ask Jonathan or Carl some questions that you want to say, or maybe like maybe share your own experience of maybe going through a process with a union rep and like what that was like seeing the union rep work for you, kind of in a way. But Carl, sorry, you got really into that, and it was really great, and there's a great list of achievements, and I definitely want to give you the
Yeah,
space later to talk about them some more.
that's
But
fine.
I also want
Thank you.
to press you a little bit on the stuff that you kind of brought up on the side. Oh, hopefully we should be able to keep it on a bit longer. Oh yeah, sorry, it's that late already. Sorry, I thought it was only, sorry, I thought it was only 7. Well, okay, then maybe we'll go straight to the audience questions, and then we can sort of, whilst the audience are thinking of their questions, we can be like, I wanna keep you on the sort of the learning and the extracurricular stuff that you were doing, and also what you were saying about trying to build long-term sustainable relationships inside the workplace. I think that's a very important theme that we kind of want to draw out a little bit more about the work of the library union rep. And maybe sort of the question that could lead us both into that is, do you find it is easy to find common ground with managers? Maybe a bit of a leading question, but Carl, since you're already in the flood, you want to continue?
I just, yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
and please put your
I
questions in the
think,
chat, or put your hand up
yeah,
if you want to ask something in person. Obviously, no pressure, but we'd
I
love to
think,
hear from you. Maybe, Toby, you got something.
okay, thank you. Yeah, really looking forward to the questions. Yeah, I mean, it completely depends is the answer. It depends on the personalities involved, the managers involved. It depends on if, the past, has there been, past situations or current situations that have been incredibly inflammatory. It's very much down about individuals and personalities as well. It can come down to that level. You could have kind of pro-union management, but you can also have incredibly aggressive anti-union management. And even just to kind of organize a meeting could be incredibly difficult. There's the game playing, there's politics, there's all that sort of thing. It's very much therefore about personal and political beliefs that individuals might hold. I think it's also about whether or not, if we're talking about managers and line management, whether they're union members as well, because that could actually, they find, you can be a member of the same union and find yourself kind of defending the managerial position, and yet actually in person actually totally agreeing with the individual who's kind of raising a concern or the issue. So I think it completely depends. But yeah,
Amazing.
it's
So we just had Darren Flynn raise his hand. So maybe Darren, do you wanna speak, or do you want to just type it in the chat? You should be able to
I'll,
unmute
I'll,
yourself. Amazing. Hi,
I'll
welcome to
speak
the
if that's
discussion.
okay.
Yeah, please do.
I was just going to ask, thanks, Carl and Jonathan, for this evening. It's been really interesting. One thing that I've sort of come across with talking about trade unions with colleagues is sometimes a bit of a confusion or sort of misapprehension about professional associations such as CILIP and trade unions and what their respective sort of roles are. I was just wondering if you had any advice about how to sort of delineate between what one does and what the other one does. I think sometimes people expect CILIP to act like a trade union, and it can be a bit
Yes.
difficult to define the two.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I would say I certainly think they're fundamentally different. I've in terms of, say, for example, CILIP, there's the advocacy on the website. It's about the advocacy for libraries and so on, and I think that sort of aspect is really important. But I think there's also a question that has to go with it, which is what and where is the political mobilization and political clout to achieve those ends? And advocacy has one place in it. But at the same time, you need to have, I think, a campaigning structure, an organization, and large bases of members that will stand up and fight for it. Because if you can't persuade someone that you're right, so for example, we've got a Tory government. If we have a Labour government that is largely going to be committed to, austerity and not investing in public services, there's probably going to be a limit to what advocacy will do. So what you're probably going to need is to be campaigning, is potentially to be taking industrial action if that's what members want to do in defence of services and to actually get more investment. So I think you need to have that political aspect, and if you don't have it, there is a question of what do you do if persuasion doesn't work. I mean, I think there's a lot of good work and probably complementarities as well. So in terms of green and environmental issues, but as I say, fundamentally, it's about how do we make change? What is, who is going to make that change? And that's where I think unions have a power and have an ability to make change that probably professional organizations don't as much.
Yeah, Carl, do you want to
Yeah,
reply there as well? And then I've got
I
a
think
question
that's
from Nora to
interesting.
follow up on this as well.
Yep, certainly. I'll try and be quick. I think we have to kind of remember that there's no one union that represents any kind of library or information knowledge stuff at the moment, and that would be incredibly complicated, I think, to instill and to create. Our jobs are linked to the structures within our particular organizations, in some senses to the sector. And I think if you had an organization like CILIP, which became potentially, a trade union, they would have to negotiate all these different kind of job kind of gradings and pay and things like that. It becomes incredibly kind of complicated from like an industrial thing. We don't have collective bargaining, rarely, if at all, in the UK anymore. So that makes things harder. I think there are some commonalities and overlaps. I completely agree with Jonathan. There's the advocacy and representation, and there's kind of the campaigning elements, but it needs to have teeth and it needs to have substance. And although CILIP does produce, great training and all these various elements, it's if you don't have people on the ground listening to your issues and actually actively working with you to change things for the better, that's you're not going to be that successful. I worked in an organization quite recently with a professional body and a trade union. It was both. And it was really interesting when we had all staff meetings about there was this kind of, it's not really Jekyll and Hyde kind of approach, but there was this kind of binary kind of setup. And, we had colleagues who were like very much anti trade union working in an organization which was trade union and a professional body. And, go figure, it's incredibly complicated. And then so, there was this senior management struggle, I think, between identity. It's like, do we push out? Do we kind of become really vocal? Do we become like the strong campaigning organization? Or do we just talk about policy and evidence-based and kind of really focus on the professional level of kind of upskilling the profession and making sure that's thing? I don't think they're incompatible, but some people did. And I think that's something CILIP would struggle with if it ever became a trade union. So
that's
probably
really
best
interesting. I think
separate.
maybe so. I don't know if you've seen Nora's question in the chat, but I think that hits very much in that same vein, and I think you kind of mostly answered it already, actually. So Nora asks, can organizations like CILIP, who are a trade organization, work with unions to help libraries? And then as a follow-up, and maybe to like steer sort of the answers a bit, is like, have unions worked with trade organizations before? As you said, sometimes it can be both. They can wear both hats, or would that cause political issues for CILIP?
I think yes and yes. So for example, the campaign to kind of save public libraries, that's a CILIP campaign. It's also a union campaign, in unison and the public sector where those where workers
sorry,
are.
Carl, before you answer, I should also say that as CILIP London, we're just a member organization, so we don't represent CILIP as a whole. We say that very clearly on our Twitter. So obviously we can't speak for all of CILIP. So this is again, as Carl and Jonathan said at the beginning, this is speaking in a personal capacity, and then so am I here. We are not CILIP. We're just we get funded by them, but like actually we're independent. We carry the name, and we're supposed to be like a member network to help people like upskill and embrace their professional standards. So obviously we can't dictate CILIP policy in any way.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
unions have worked with trade organizations. I think, one of the core things is that you don't go it alone. You look for people with the shared values and aims and kind of shared policies, and you go, if you want to go big and you want to go parliamentary lobbying, you find all your allies, and that's the thing. That's how you win. You have to do things kind of in a much broader thing. If you go it alone, you're pretty much destined not to succeed unless you have some great kind of insider support. But yeah, I think the answer is we work with anybody we need to get the job done. That sounds kind of quite brutal, but I think that's
Wow.
basically it, though.
Wow,
if you want to succeed.
I think that's kind of beautiful. And I'm sorry, I know, Jonathan, you're veering here to speak some more, but I have to unfortunately say that we are now at the end of our event. As I said, our time has been set for an hour, and I've just some housekeeping stuff I need to get in. But if you want to stay on for a while longer and discuss some more, I'll turn the recording off and we can keep going. That's very easy. But in terms of the hour we've set for this is now over, and I have to plug just a couple more things. One is that we have, if you like this sort of event, if you like the vibe, if you like the people, then you can also meet us in person and see our legs at our upcoming spring social, which is on the 16th of May, which is also my sister's birthday. Funnily enough, we'll be meeting at the Garrick Arms in Charing Cross. Very informal. You don't have to be a Celeb member to attend, but maybe after you've joined us, you might want to walk out being a Celeb member if you feel like it. And then obviously at the beginning, we had our Celeb London YouTube channel, which you can follow, and you'll find a recording of this event. And also the Celeb London Twitter account, which will keep you up to date about future events, and also who the committee is, and also if you want to, how to join Celeb. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion today. I hope you learned something. I hope you've taken something away for your professional development. If you would like to write it up for us, you can do that and we can publish it on our blog. But for now, this is the official end of the event. And if you'd like to stay on, please do. So I'm going to stop the recording now. If I figure, yeah, this one.